Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon to everyone listening today, especially our colleagues who made time despite this being a hectic part of the semester. I reckon that my talk would take around 40 minutes, so I'll get right into it. I hope to cover the pedagogical, historical, and theoretical contexts of my discussion of Tash Aw's novel before delving into my analysis of the text itself. So these are the outline of what I hope to cover today. Okay. So, the novel at the center of today's lecture is one of the readings included in a special topics course that I taught 2 years ago, titled English 198 Narratives of Authoritarian Rule and Everyday Resistance in the Shadow of Pax Americana. A mouthful, I know. My aim with that course was to assemble a corpus of narrative texts that portray social transformations, ideological tensions, and everyday experiences tied to the Cold War in Asia. Much of the literature on the Cold War centers the ideological, military, and economic conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. And yet, this bipolarity was not only complicated by the rise of Communist China since 1949 as a regional hegemon, but was also entangled with decolonial movements and civil wars instigated by ethnic tensions, territorial disputes, or communist insurgencies and state repressions thereof. Most of the countries in Asia today gained independence in the Cold War era and thereby became participants and battlegrounds in political and economic contests among superpowers for regional hegemony. The importance of Asia in the global history of the Cold War notwithstanding, this area remains relatively understudied from the perspectives of Asians themselves, and this lacuna is especially true of Southeast Asia. Yet, it is worth paying attention to this historical juncture, for as the historian Ang Cheng Guan writes, memories of the Cold War continue to loom large in shared memories. The trauma of war, political chaos, violence, riots, and revolutions. Through our readings of literary texts, which mediate the past and its political and cultural contestations through their recollection and representations in the present, we sought to excavate these buried memories. Through the close reading of selected novels, short fiction, and nonfiction, English 198 invited students to reflect on the problems of the post-colonial contemporary, including right-wing populist movements, authoritarian nostalgia, repudiations of neoliberalism, the so-called New Cold War between the United States and China, and continuing decolonial movements and other so-called revolutions of our time. Our class discussions were guided by the following questions. First, how has the Cold War shaped the political structures, cultures, and subjectivities of the peoples of a rapidly transforming Asia? How have the writers of this region depicted and reckoned with the violences of war and revolution, the utopian aspirations and dystopian experiences of nationalist, communist, and democratic movements, the rise of US backed military dictatorships, and quasi colonial US military occupations and interventions in an age when the United States claimed for itself the leadership of the so called free world? And would it be possible to think about these questions beyond the normative frames of Western imperial modernity and what Prasenjit Duara called the imperialism of nation states? Would it be possible instead to attend to the voices and experiences of individuals and collectivities who are often erased or occluded in national and global histories, which tend to tell the stories of the victors? Could we instead pay attention to the manner in which stories are told and who is allowed to articulate what? These were some of the things that we thought and talked about in that class. The course, as I saw it, served two main aims. First, to engage with and contribute to the conversations of post-colonial studies, in which, as Schwab-Mengwat observed, Southeast Asia does not figure significantly, even if Southeast Asia is one of the most colonized regions in the world. Linked to this aim are the practices that characterize the intellectual project of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. Practices and strategies deployed under the banner of what Chua Meng Wat called inter-Asian referencing include multiplying the objects of identification and constructing alternative frames of reference instead of always referencing the colonizer when doing post-colonial critique. Second, mutual referencing to deepen the analysis of the local. The idea being that looking at other comparable contexts serves a somewhat defamiliarizing function that helps us to more clearly see or to better understand the nuances of our own experiences. And third, cultivating a transnational intellectual community that is able to accumulate knowledge about societies across the region and thereby develop an analytical framework that facilitates comparative analysis from the angle of the continent as a whole. It matters that such a comparative perspective is cultivated through conversations among those living within the region rather than from the perspective of a privileged or dominant outsider trying to explain or control the other. In designing the special topics course, then, I sought to explore the extent to which my students and I could engage with post-colonial and decolonial and inter-Asia conversations and center Asian perspectives in a comparative frame from within the disciplinary silo of English literature under which this course was offered. The second aim of the course was to attend to the work of literature as a form of remembering otherwise elements that are willfully effaced from the national narrative. That's from Holden, from the national narrative of post-colonial nation states. Pedagogies of nationalism tend to counter the subjugating narratives of the colonizer, but it's important to remember that they are also written from the perspective of the incumbent powers, the national elite. Therefore, their teleological bent is to justify or legitimize the present dispensation, often contrasting the road to modernization as nation building with the underdeveloped, materially deprived, bad old days. With these interpretations, Chua argues, there is little time for critical examination of the past with the aim of recovering and resurrecting suppressed voices and sentiments. And we notice this even now in public discourse when some injustice from the past is brought up in order to critique something in the present. One common riposte is, move on na kasi, why can't you move on? Such suppressed voices and sentiments often find expression in literature, and so attending to literary works can illuminate our post-neo-colonial present in ways that potentially complicate the narratives of official state histories, ideological orthodoxies, popular demagoguery, viral disinformation, or perspicuous political theories. In this way, not only does the exercise of literary creation and criticism become a way of unthinking the restrictions of presentist modes of understanding, it also enables us to better see the traces of the different forms of colonialism that haunt our everyday life worlds, and to potentially generate counter narratives that remind us of other possibilities. Aside from embedding the texts within the problem space of the Cold War in Asia, another way by which we developed a comparative perspective in English 198 was to use a common theoretical basis for analysis. That is Fredric Jameson's 1986 essay, Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. In this essay, Jameson posited that what distinguishes third world literature is that these texts are necessarily allegorical. That is to say that they are, quote, to be read as national allegories, particularly when their forms develop out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, such as the novel. This is not to say that all literature emanating from the Third World are written by their authors necessarily to serve as national allegories, but the critic may, for the purposes of opening up a historical perspective, read them as such. Jameson proposed two interventions in the study and teaching of Third World texts, particularly for those in the position of doing literary and cultural studies and wishing to support anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist struggles. The first intervention consists in historicizing texts and analyzing the various sociocultural situations from which they spring. The second intervention is recognizing the ways in which the mapping or grasping of the social totality is structurally available to the dominated rather than the dominating classes. In this way, we may read the post-colonial novel as a textual object that presents what Jameson called cognitive map of post-colonial society, particularly from the perspective of colonized subjects. The four dimensions of analysis for third world literature proposed by Jameson are first, the libidinal dimension of the story, second, the structure of its allegory, third, the role of the third world cultural producer, and fourth, the perspective of futurity projected by the tale's resolution. I will elaborate these dimensions as we look more closely at the text at hand. Okay, so map of the invisible world. If one of the aims of English 198 was to develop a comparative perspective on people's experiences of the Cold War in Asia through the inter-Asian referencing of post-colonial literary texts, then reading Tash Aw's second novel, Map of the Invisible World, was generative. Tash Aw was born in Taiwan, brought up in Malaysia, was educated in the UK, and is now based in London. He writes primarily for an Anglophone audience, but his novels are about Asia, particularly from the perspective of migrants and minorities and border crossers bearing hybrid or fluid identities. Map of the Invisible World, Aw's second novel, primarily concerns the problem space of Indonesia at the tail end of Sukarno's presidency. The novel is particularly interesting to me because it is set during a time when the maps of the world were being redrawn, when borders were disputed and negotiated, and indeed were fought over in wars. Such contested borders include not only physical territorial borders, as in the creation or reconfiguration of nation states, but also the boundaries of belonging, of inside and outside us and them. In our time, the deterritorializing forces of globalization are met with the resurgence of various ethno-nationalisms, including those expressed in racist and xenophobic public discourse, anti-immigrant policies, trade wars, and even genocidal violence. In such polarizing times, it may be instructive to look at how belonging to a particular community at various scales was imagined otherwise. That is, not only along the lines of racial, ethno-linguistic, tribal, or religious identities. There are, of course, multiple entry points to discussing these themes. For example, we could, as Jameson suggested, examine the role of the third world cultural producer within the diegetic narrative as well as without. In Map of the Invisible World, the prominent cultural producers are mostly white characters working in academia, news media, and art. They are the ones who purvey representations of and knowledge about Indonesia to the rest of the world, while local intellectuals and artists still struggle to conjure the people and fashion a unifying identity out of a plural and intensely diverse society. For the purposes of this talk, however, I will focus on how the novel imagines the post-colonial body politic and examines processes of nation formation through the representations of bodies and the movements of these bodies within and across territorialized nation space. The first part of this discussion explores the various meanings evoked by the seeming impossibility of the title's cartographic metaphor and what they suggest about the novel's thematic preoccupations. The second part considers the structure of the novel's allegory or how it links the private and public dimensions of post-colonial experience through its depiction of the splitting of the Malay world as symbolized by the separation of two orphan brothers against the geopolitical backdrop of confrontasi. Finally, I turn to the fictional island of Nusa Perdo, where much of the early action is set, and where the main characters return toward the end of the novel to examine how the future suggested by the novel's resolution articulates an alternative vision of national belonging. I want to have an Indonesian child, a boy. He'll be my alter ego, except better, happier, all the things I could have been but wasn't. We'll live in a house by the sea just like the one in Buru that I remember as a child. Only this time there'll be no unhappiness, just laughter and gifts. So confides Carl de Villigen, a Dutch painter, to his American friend in Bali in the late 1930s. After the Dutch transfer of sovereignty to the Indonesian Republic in 1949 following revolution, Karl would get his wish. He would take Indonesian citizenship, live in a small outlying island off the coast of East Java, adopt an orphan boy of possibly Sumatran parentage, and raise the boy, whom he names Adam, to be a good Indonesian, celebrating his birthday on Independence Day and even refusing to teach him Dutch, the language of the erstwhile colonizer and of the educated elite. However, a few weeks before Indonesia celebrated its 19th year of independence, Adam would watch his foster father be abducted by Indonesian military forces from their home as part of a campaign against imperialists, communists, and other supposed enemies of the nation. It is 1964, the year that President Sukarno famously called a year of living dangerously. In his Independence Day address, he calls for vigilance against the forces of colonialism and imperialism through the continuation of the Indonesian Revolution. The speech in hindsight evokes a fateful prescience, delivered as it is roughly a year prior to the 1965-1966 anti-communist killings, which ended Sukarno's rule and led to the rise of Suharto's authoritarian New Order regime. The G30's military coup and consequent anti-communist purges, and events brought to popular consciousness by Joshua Oppenheimer's film The Act of Killing, have not yet occurred at this time, but already the country is in political and economic turmoil. Inflation and unemployment are high, masses of people are starving, uprisings are happening in rural areas over land conflicts, and in the capital city of Jakarta, violence is escalating between student demonstrators and the army. Sukarno, while still massively popular, is aging and ailing, is plagued with allegations of political and moral corruption, and struggles to mediate between the left and right wings of his government. Adding to, or perhaps distracting from, these domestic economic and political crises is Sukarno's foreign policy of confrontasi or confrontation, involving armed hostilities in opposition to the formation of Malaysia. In the face of these tense situations, Adam sets off from the outlying island of Nusa Perdo, which in this slide is located near the center of the archipelago in red, and travels for a week to Jakarta to to seek help from his father's friend Margaret, an American professor with links to Western media and the CIA in Indonesia. Along this journey, he also meets Din and Zubaida, who are intellectual activists pursuing divergent ideals and divergent paths in the name of national revolution. Din is an aspiring historian whose experiences of racial discrimination as an Indonesian graduate student in the Netherlands have radicalized him towards nativism and extremist violence. Later on in the novel, he would, engage in a plan to assassinate Sukarno. Zubaida is a student leader of an underground Marxist propaganda movement that is very critical of Sukarno. Later in the narrative, she is revealed to be the daughter of one of the president's top crony industrialists and is therefore part of the class that she is railing against. Through these encounters and his journey from his remote island to the country's capital in Java, the young and sheltered Adam is forced to confront what it means to be Indonesian. The novel, told in third person, juxtaposes the perspectives of three characters, Adam, Margaret, and Johan, Adam's estranged brother who was adopted by a wealthy couple in Kuala Lumpur, in order to tell its multi-layered story of a nation and a region on the brink of horrific violence. As the consciousness of these various characters flits from the present to the past and back, the reader is brought to witness events unfolding in multiple timelines and settings. In effect, the novel constellates the various remembrances, experiences, ways of thinking, and living in the nascent nation. These interwoven narratives complicate what Saxena calls aspects of identity and belonging in a way that subverts the notions of authentic origin or singular national identity. Instead, the narrative creates an alternative social structure that highlights diverse and multiple forms of belonging where social-political conflicts coexist with concerns with multiculturalism and plurality, unquote. Such an alternative structure, Saxena argues, quote, fits a post-colonial multicultural nation, unquote. For example, the novel portrays the lives of so-called Westerners like Carl and Margaret, who were born and came of age in the Dust East Indies, are conversant in local languages and cultures, and have formed intense emotional attachments to the country that would be called Indonesia. After independence, they stay in the country and try to participate in the project of nation building and call themselves Indonesian. They think of themselves as Indonesian, even if they are indelibly marked as other by virtue of their race. In his examination of Indonesian national identity formation, the historian Henk Nordholt observes that the early years of independence were characterized by a triumphant nationalism, as the leaders of the new nation were shaped by the sense of being part of the national revolution. In the 1950s, however, the questions of how to give cultural content to sovereignty and how to reconcile a deeply felt desire for progress and modernity with cultural artifacts and practices inherited from the colonial past were only beginning to be addressed. What it meant to be Indonesian, therefore, was seen as a process of continuous creation, process of creativity itself. The map of the invisible world, then, in a sense, could be understood as pertaining to this process of constructing the Indonesian people and national culture and reconfiguring social space. In this process, mobility, open mindedness, and an orientation towards the future collided with a desire for rootedness, centralized identities, and a focus on the past. Thus, Norholt argues, the debate about Indonesia's national culture oscillated between an outwardly oriented modernity and an inward looking nativism. This relationship between the past and futurity in shaping the post colonial present is reflected in the two instances in the novel where the characters make explicit mention of an invisible world. The first is in chapter 3, where Din discusses his graduate research ambitions with Margaret, ambitions that remain unfulfilled. He writes, or he says, I was looking into writing a secret history of the Indonesian islands in the southeast, everything from Bali eastwards. To me, those islands were like a lost world where everything remained true and authentic, away from the gaze of foreigners, kind of invisible world. My idea was that we needed a history of our country written by an Indonesian, something that explored non-standard sources that Westerners could not easily reach, like folk stories, local mythology, or ancient manuscripts written on palm leaves. The second instance occurs in chapter 19, where Din takes Adam walking through dilapidated urbanscapes in the poverty-stricken outskirts of Jakarta. Adam reflects on the distance between his imagination of the capital when he was a young boy living on an island and his concrete experience of the decaying city now. He says, no trees lined the road. Adam could see no vegetation or foliage, just a forest of concrete structures built in fantastic shapes, conceived in a dream. He was tired of walking. He was tired of this city. It was not at all like the city he had once constructed in his imagination. He could barely remember that invisible world he had once known so intimately, a place full of love and possibility and promise. And it bears remarking again that this invisible world of Adam's imagination is something that he just imagines in his little island hut on Nusa Perdo. Oh, sorry. Mm, Let me just. Okay. In Din's case, the impossibility of mapping the invisible world consists in the anachronistic impossibility of capturing a true and authentic pre-colonial Indonesian essence from a lost world where the concept of Indonesia as a nation did not even exist. Din's desire to write such a secret history belies the burden of national historiography, that is, the invention of the nation through the excavation of fragments of the past. National history is also oriented toward futurity by quote, aligning itself with the trajectories of nationalism and the efforts of nation building, according to Saxena. The failure of such efforts of recollection, effective storytelling, or of nation building leads to the invisible world of a promised and desired future that never arrives. Or, as Din exclaims, the president talks about grand projects, but we all know that there's never going to be any money, not for people like me. So they had all of these dreams about national development and the national prosperity, but the fact was that the objective conditions of post-colonial Indonesia prevented those dreams from materializing. While Adam's glittering imaginings of Jakarta are influenced by his foster father's nationalist fervor, we may also extend this reading of the invisible world as a world dreamed not quite into being by recalling the hopes articulated in the Afro-Asian Conference of 1955, hosted by Indonesia in the city of Bandung in April 1955. So the Bandung Conference celebrates its 70th anniversary this month. So, the Bandung spirit of self-determination and prosperity, following national liberation and cooperation among newly sovereign nation states pursuing their own paths to development, had, by the present of the novel, become an ethereal fog. As Tricontinental put it, while the subjective conditions for cooperation and exchange existed, the objective conditions did not. All the infrastructure inherited by newly independent states had been constructed by imperialism to facilitate extraction from the periphery to the core. This, coupled with massive corruption among the elite classes, caused much disillusionment among the populace. The Indonesia that was on a trajectory towards democracy, press freedom, absence of religious conflict, and vertical mobility was overtaken by an Indonesia where, quote, the state was no longer seen as an instrument to build a nation and to safeguard citizenship, but a resource that fueled neo-patrimonial networks, unquote. While the promise of third world sovereignty was frustrated by the global economic order and internal conflicts, in the next section I turn to a different kind of challenge to the spirit of solidarity in the third world, the coloniality that haunts processes of nation formation as these manifest in the novel's depiction of confrontasi. So, the trauma of postcoloniality is perhaps most strikingly symbolized in the novel by the story of two orphan brothers, Adam and Johan, who are separated in early childhood. The elder brother, Johan, is adopted by a wealthy couple from Kuala Lumpur, while Adam remains in Indonesia, later to be adopted by Carl. Adam retains hardly any memories before his life with Carl, and this lack of knowledge about his past contributes to his sense of confusion about his place in the world. He struggles to define who he is, not knowing where he is from or who his people are. Carl brings him up in a capacious romantic notion of national identity, in which anyone who professes loyalty to the nation and solidarity with the masses and learns folk songs and folk stories has the right to claim himself Indonesian. And yet, Adam is bullied by the other Indonesian children in his school because he lives with an orang putih, or a white man, and is better fed and better clothed than the rest of them. To survive, he resigns himself to the darkness of the world beyond his seaside home. The landscape of his past, writes Tash Aw, would become still and colorless as if mist had drifted from the sea. It took him a mere few weeks to ease into his new world, one in which this white man was no longer a foreigner, but someone who was always present, who made Adam feel that this place was safe and unchanging and unconnected to the past. Determined to forget the buried memories of his life at the orphanage, Adam reflects, home was not necessarily where you were born or even where you grew up, but something else entirely, something fragile that could exist anywhere in the world. Thus, his home with Carl in Nusa Perdo becomes for Adam not only a safe and stable haven, but all his world, an enchanted space, a metaphoric island in an island that is insulated from the political reality of the rest of the archipelagic nation. As Tash Aw writes, quote, Adam knew that there were troubles elsewhere in Indonesia. He had heard that there was a revolution of some sort. But those are problems that belong to Java and Sumatra, the other end of this country of islands, strung out across the sea like seaweed on the shore, unquote. However, as trouble reaches the outlying islands and Carl is arrested, all of the island for Adam becomes dark and inhospitable, no longer a space of belonging or relationship. Adam then sets off to the mainland in search of connection. Yet, instead of a sense of affinity or belonging, his encounters with the crowd out in the city streets to celebrate Independence Day sensorially evoke his metaphoric islandness. In the face of the mass, what he calls, quote, an inhuman gathering of humans, unquote, he feels as though he were wading in a swamp through dense foliage, engulfed by the soundlessness of being underwater, just like that time that he almost drowned in the sea. Noticing his reactions, Din tells him, Adam, you need to find your past, your real past. If that means finding your brother, then yes, you must. Because to be ignorant of one's true history is to live in a void. It's as if you are floating aimlessly in the sea, being dragged every which way by currents and waves. And we are not a country that was made for this. That is the problem. We can never go forward, unquote. Johann, meanwhile, remembers the past and the orphanage and the brother that he was forced to leave behind. Not knowing what he became of his brother, and prevented by his adoptive parents from conducting a search, like Adam, he cruises through life, literally and metaphorically in a fast car, but with no real sense of where to go. Instead, he feels like his life is not his own, that he can't control it, that his real life is somewhere else. Someone has stolen it and taken it to another place far away. And so he spends his days asleep and his nights speeding around Kuala Lumpur, doing drugs, flirting with prostitutes. Or writes, in this fast young city, he did not want to sleep, he did not want to stop. This was a place that had no past, only the present. Every night was the same. Readings of the novel seldom pay attention to the parts of the novel that are set in Kuala Lumpur, henceforth KL, except to note that Adam's brother was taken there. Indeed, it is possible to excise the KL scenes from the work and still have a cohesive narrative. But the events set in Indonesia are told in numbered chapters, while the scene with Johan and KL are not given such a structure, would seem to suggest that the KL part of the story is extraneous to the main narrative. Yet it is important to remember that the historical drama shaping the characters' preoccupations and conversations is the military conflict of confrontasi or confrontation. Confrontasi denotes Indonesia's opposition to the formation of the Federation of Malaysia on the grounds of it being, quote, a neo-colonialist, neo-imperialist enemy, in the words of Indonesian Foreign Minister Subandrio at that time. Or, in the words of Din, echoing Sukarno's rhetoric, Malaysia does not exist. Malaysia is a British construct. It is a work of pure fiction created by the old imperialist countries to destabilize Indonesia and all the newly independent countries of the world. It was created so that Britain and America and their cronies can continue to have a presence in this region. But I tell you, their time is finished. Finished. We will invade them and crush them and all those Malaysian puppets. They look like us and even speak our language, but they do not know that they are being used. They are not masters of their own destiny. We are. Unquote. The confluence of British interests, decolonization, domestic politics, and the Cold War that ultimately decided the merger of the Federation of Malaya with Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak are too complex to discuss at length here. What I wish to emphasize is how the novel's depiction of confrontasi illustrates the constructedness and even fragility of nation and national identity and the fluidity of forms of belonging. Such fragility and fluidity, which otherwise could engender tender solidarities, are instead disavowed by discourses of ethnonationalism, especially when articulated in the language of racialized anti-colonialism amidst decolonization and the Cold War. The conflicts engendered by the rift between Indonesia and Malaysia, which the novel presents as a traumatic event in post-colonial history, finds a parallel expression in the forced separation of the two brothers. Thus, the inclusion of Malaysia and of Johann's perspective in the novel evokes older and more expansive conceptions of regional association and exchange that predate the emergence of post-colonial nation states, such as expressed by the old Javanese term Nusantara. literally meaning in between islands. Nusantara has often been translated into English as archipelago. It has been used variously to denote parts of maritime Southeast Asia or the sea between islands in the Malay world. Indeed, in his analysis of maritime imagery in Tash Aw's map, Sim argues that images of the sea, of water, and of swimming often accompany points of connection and, quote, affiliative allegiance, unquote. They are, for Sim, image figurations of the sublime that aim at an expansive notion of fraternity, at the fellow feeling that takes us out of ourselves. Thus, MAP counterposes nativism or filiation with affiliation that involves the crossing of ethnocultural as well as social class borders. Such use of oceanic imagery and archipelagic formations then gestures toward relations and connections obscured by the nation form. Adam's story, as told in the novel, begins and ends in Nusa Perdo, literally Lost Island, a fictional island located by the novel off the coast of East Java. The trope of the island usually functions as a quote topos of autonomous subjectivity, unquote. Its remoteness and boundedness evoke structures of utopian or dystopian experiments and imprisonment, as well as fantasies of paradisiacal escape and exotic discovery, especially to the colonial gaze. When Carl first moved to Nusa Perdo, taking with him the 5-year-old Adam from the orphanage to build a family and a home, the island served as a kind of crucible for incubating an alternative imagination of nation, one that is not caged to the unitizing logics of racial filiation, common ideology, or of the shared history of colonial oppression and humiliation. Rather, the basis of national belonging, as Carl taught the young Adam, was the effective investment in the present and future of the nation, the commitment to share in its destiny. Adam's return to the island with Margaret and Carl, whose recovery was facilitated by Zubaida's high-level connections, would seem to suggest the triumph of chosen affinities over essentialized yet historically burdened identitarian differences. Now, this family seems to be once again safe and insulated from the chaos besieging the capital and are hopeful for the new life that they would create together as a hybrid unit. But actually, the novel doesn't end with that hopeful scene. Instead, it closes with the image of Johann speeding through KL, wishing that his place had no past. But quote, the night seemed long and deep and silent, writes Tash Aw. And from what we know of the events in Indonesia after 1964, the world to come was dark as night indeed. And this is where I will conclude. The post-war era of decolonization was a time of redrawing maps as European empires lost their hold over Asia and Africa, and new sovereign states came to be. Yet, the question of along which and whose lines post-colonial borders were to be drawn was often contingent on inherited colonial boundaries or contested by historical debates, ongoing wars, or treaty negotiations brokered by imperialist powers. In the face of the bipolarizing forces of the Cold War, and with the deployment of new relations of dominance and dependence to transplant the formerly colonial ones, the map of the invisible world may denote a world that is yet to be, an incomplete revolution leading to true sovereignty for decolonizing countries. It may also denote confusion and uncertainty about what the world is supposed to look like, as fledgling states find that quote, the question of what we were going to do with our independence when it was finally attained, unquote, as Sukarno said in his opening address to the Bandung Conference in 1955, turns out to be a lot more complicated than what is allowed by the rhetoric of unity and diversity. So I end with that question of what we are going to do now with our independence when it was finally attained, and the complications of that question given the plural nature of many post-colonial societies. So thank you for listening, and I hope that I look forward to your questions and other comments in the Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much.